Good to see you, everyone. My name is Robbie Howell. I am a game designer, a lover of history, and an Age of Empires 2 enthusiast. And in this series, Theory Crafting, we take a look at some of the civilizations, units, and similar that are not yet available in Age of Empires 2, but could be, and I take a crack at designing them in the game, with all of my various foibles, flaws, and fun. For this particular episode, we're going to be taking inspiration from a commenter. I have a lot of fantastic commenters on this channel. You guys give me so many great ideas. And in this particular case, good old Jen Exopy, I see what you did there, has asked for a Swiss Theorycraft. From what I understand, the Swiss are a civilization that a great many theory crafters out there on the internet have done in the past. The fantastic Mantis AoE2 has taken a spin on the Swiss already, though I have not yet watched that video. So today, we are going to be taking a look at the Swiss. Today's video will be a slightly different format than some of the ones in the past. I've made some updates to my presentation style, so if you have any thoughts on those, I'd love to hear them down in the comment section below. A couple disclaimers before we start. I am a hobbyist, not a historian. Designs are untested. You know all of them. If you want more details, take a look on the screen right now. My build of the Swiss is a defensive civilization with some truly wacky aspects to it that I very much hope that you will enjoy or find very good critiques for in turn, as you guys very often do. As always, if you'd like to see the full details on this particular build, take a look at the comprehensive civilization document down in the description, which includes all of my sources. And with that, let's jump into Swiss history, Swisstory, if you will. When we're talking about Swiss history, we're primarily looking at about 1000 AD onwards, but that isn't to say that Switzerland was not occupied before then. It certainly was. Being positioned kind of smack dab in the center of Europe, it's a bit of a crossroads for various migratory peoples, though the Alps' impenetrability and hostility typically made it not a very pleasant place to live, at least during the early parts of the Middle Ages. So originally, Switzerland was home to the Helvetians, who were a Celtic people, but then the Celtic Helvetians were joined by a bunch of Germanic migrants. These various peoples include the Lombards. You can check out my build for them up here if you would like. But even after all of this colonization, the majority of the Swiss Alps remained largely rural and really couldn't be traveled. The terrain was just too dramatic for people to effectively cross them in a safe manner, and much less colonize them. And so for a couple hundred years, the Alps were left relatively untouched. However, starting around the 1000s-ish AD, a couple of prominent trade routes and roads started to open up in the area. And so surrounding lords started sending in groups of peasants to, pillage the land of its materials and set up a couple of colonies. And these colonies became fairly wealthy and also were very much autonomous, still ruled by a lord in name only, but the lords couldn't really enforce their will on these places because they were so inaccessible. There were quite a few powers that sent people into the Swiss Alps, but the most prominent among them were the Holy Roman Empire and the Austrians, here represented by the Magyars, which is not an accurate shield. The Austrians should be their own civilization. We'll tackle that one in the future. But in addition to that, the French Burgundians were another major player, as were the northern Italians, especially the city of Milan. And over the couple centuries that followed, this semi-autonomy started to bloom into full-on republicanism. Not only would a lot of these rural communities and townships start to develop their own local councils, start to develop their own local laws, but a lot of their surrounding powers actually supported this. That was until the Austrian Habsburgs decided that enough was enough, and they wanted to enforce a little bit more of their rule of law on their particular Swiss colonies. And while they were there, they kind of decided, might as well take the lot. This Austrian occupation and the general unpopularity they gained in so doing eventually led to a fateful moment in 1291, when 3 autonomous Swiss communities, those being the cantons of Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden, together signed the federal charter of the Old Swiss Confederacy. This confederation initially was founded in order to explicitly resist the Habsburgs, which they did very, very effectively. In fact, despite being a bunch of largely untrained mountain peasants, they fought with unbelievable ferocity and won unprecedented victories against elite Austrian knights. Though it would would take them over a century to do so. This old Swiss confederacy would eventually succeed in rebuffing the Austrians from its borders, in the process gathering many new cantons, the term for an autonomous Swiss community that would eventually join the confederacy, including Lucerne, Zurich, Glarus and Zug, and Bern. Now, during this period, in addition to kicking the Austrians in the rear on multiple occasions, the Swiss started to get a lot of attention from the surrounding European powers, partially because of their effectiveness against one of Europe's most influential royal families, but also because a great many local cities and provinces and communities began looking to the Swiss as potential allies and protectors. It was a lot harder to push around some rural community when they could just turn Swiss. And as such, the Swiss began to become a fairly substantial geopolitical player in Central Europe. And this role would only continue as the years passed. The Swiss gained massive economic hegemony because, as mentioned, they controlled a great many newly founded trade routes that would connect, for example, Italy with Germany, which is incredibly important for these major powers to have control over. So the Swiss became brokers of trade in the region, as well as starting to upgrade their economy from basic peasant subsistence farming and forestry into more professional trades, stuff that we still kind of know Switzerland for today, like cheesemaking, clockmaking, and similar. More importantly, the Swiss also developed a reputation for their mercenaries. Their people had developed a lot of military skill during their fight against the Austrians, and many hot-headed young Swiss men would join what were known as the Swiss Guards, regiments of mercenaries who served in courts all across Europe. Swiss Guard were known for their unquestioning loyalty and skill at arms, as well as their often reckless bravery in battle. And in addition to shipping these mercenaries out to foreign powers, the Swiss kept an intensely powerful core of them in reserve for their own military campaigns. Because even though they were a republic, the Swiss began to develop something of an imperialistic ambition as they gained in power. They fought a number of major wars against the Burgundians, for one, who they slapped around pretty convincingly, and then later on against Italy and then France within the same couple of years. In the process, not only did they expand their confederacy, taking on a bunch of other major members, Solothurn, Fribourg, Schaffhausen, Basel, and Appenzell, but also their armies became so threatening that the Holy Roman Empire actually developed a specific style of mercenary soldier just to counter their influence within Europe. And so, this small republic, once a rural subsistence agriculture economy made up of a couple of plucky city-states, had suddenly become one of the strongest powers in Europe. And it was only their loss to the French at the Battle of Marignano that the Swiss began to retreat away from open battle as a nation and started to establish what we would still know today as a policy of neutrality. They would continue to expand their confederacy, but they would mostly stay firmly within the Alps and would be less inclined towards supporting other independent city-states and provinces like they had done during their heyday. In a lot of these Theorycraft history sections, we see nations that were previously relatively humble go through a major glow-up and become incredibly prominent players on the world stage, and I feel like the Swiss are one of the best examples of that. Though unlike a lot of these other powers that would fall off a cliff and go into ruin, the Swiss kind of quit while they were ahead. Yeah, they had one major loss, but it didn't lead to the loss of their nation or their independence. They managed to keep growing their economic and political influence even once their military ambitions started to slow. But military ambitions is part of what makes AoE2 a great game, and so fortunately that happens well beyond the AoE2 relevant time frame, so we can focus on the Swiss during their exciting, action-packed imperial years. Let's move on to their flavor. In Age of Empires 2, I would represent the Swiss as having Central European architecture, much like the Teutons and Vikings and similar. They would have a unique skin for the town center, which is a very important building for them, even more important than usual. And they would have a very special language. Rather than just speaking one language, the Swiss would speak multiple. Whenever you clicked on or tasked a Swiss unit, it would have an equal chance of speaking a line of either Middle High German, same as the Teutons, Bregonian, same as the Burgundians, Medieval Latin, same as the Italians, or Lombardic, same as my build of the Lombards. Gute Grüße euch, bonjour, salve, and ben reat to all of you, my friends. Switzerland has always been a melting pot of different peoples coming together under shared ideals rather than language or culture. And so I feel like this shared language would not only set them majorly apart, but also be the best representation of how their medieval culture and modern culture actually is and was, rather than boiling it all down to a single tongue. Their wonder would be the Zittglocke. This gigantic clock tower was actually erected during the AoE2 relevant time frame, and besides being a very cool, beautiful building, I think would stand out massively from other wonders in the game. I don't think we have anything even close to a clock tower in Age of Empires so far. And with those surface level flavor elements out of the way, let's move on to their campaigns. The Swiss are an interesting lot in that they don't have as many individual heroes guiding the course of their history, and instead their history is more defined by mass uprisings versus common enemies. That being said, we're going to start with William Tell. Everyone knows him, there's an overture for him. He shot an apple off of his son's head and jumped out of a boat and sunk it. He's a cool guy, but unfortunately he's completely mythical, or at least as best as we can tell. But that's okay. It's fine to have an Age of Empires campaign have strongly mythical elements. Plus, it would just be so dang exciting. All sorts of cool high micro scenarios where you're fleeing the wicked Austrians and rousing support among the peasants, and eventually leading to the mythical Oath of Rütli that led to the founding of the Federal Charter of Switzerland itself. So, though mythical, I think William Tell would be a great protagonist for a campaign. But if we want to go for historical accuracy, there are many better options, such as the Burgundian War. As mentioned, the Swiss fought a very impactful war versus Burgundy in around 1474, I believe. Charles the Bold of Burgundy had imperial ambitions, and one of his first targets was the Swiss cantons nearby, and the Swiss responded far more fiercely than he could have ever imagined. While you would be primarily fighting the Burgundians in this campaign, it would feature other civilizations that were local to that part of Europe at the time. You'd have Teuton allies, you'd have Frankish allies, and even your old foes, the Austrians, would sign a temporary peace treaty to help out in dealing with this new Burgundian threat. So I think there'd be a lot of civ diversity, a lot of really cool battle set pieces, and a great opportunity to show off your tactics as a general. There is another option, though, which is the repulsing of the Habsburgs. As mentioned, this happened over the course of a century, and so there's a lot of content to potentially choose from. The Habsburg Rebellion also showed off a lot of really interesting tactics, like rolling logs off of cliffs and sealing enemies into choke points in mountain ranges, which I think could lend itself to some really dynamic and interesting gameplay that would set it apart from just about any other campaign. The one downside is it would primarily be Swiss versus Austrians, and the Austrians don't exist in the game yet, though they should, and so there wouldn't be fantastic civ diversity, even if the historical depth and strategic diversity would be massive. Beyond their own primary campaign feature, the Swiss could potentially appear in some other campaigns that currently exist in-game, though I'll be honest, pickings are slim. In Barbarossa 1, there's a whole bunch of city-states, and maybe you could fit the Swiss in as one of those to add a little more civ diversity. Similarly, in Attila 6, the cities of northern Italy have some random picks like the Britons, so maybe the Swiss would be better there. Alaric 5 also features a couple of various Italian and French factions that the Swiss could fill in for, and the Jan Žižka campaign could, again, potentially have a Swiss player just to make the civilizations have a little more breadth, but to be honest, there's not really a lot of options for the Swiss could fit into the current game, which I was kind of surprised by considering how central they are, but at the same time, it's not too much of a surprise when you consider that they tended to be a rather reclusive people who mostly fought defensive wars against people invading their own lands rather than going out and meddling in others' affairs. Before we wrap up here, a couple other campaign options for the Swiss. Most of these would be one-off scenarios, but I personally find one-off scenarios to be very underrated and often a lot of fun. A great way to show the civilization in a couple other lights that a campaign for them might not quite be able to show off in the same way. For example, the Second Kappel War. This happened in the 1500s when Switzerland went through a major religious reform, and Protestants and Roman Catholics started to fight all across the Confederacy. This led to religious tensions which in some ways still exist today, and would feature a very interesting and nuanced campaign protagonist in the Protestant leader Zwingli. That being said, this campaign would be primarily Swiss on Swiss violence, which, while it could be fun, might not hold people's attention for a whole 5 to 6 scenarios, so I could see it not quite being what people wanted. Another option would be the Battle of Marignano itself. This would be a single scenario fought against the French, and I could see it being not only an incredibly dramatic, vast set-piece battle where you're dealing with strategy and the French are hopelessly outnumbering you, it could even kind of be like the end of Halo Reach, where your only objective is to hold out as long as possible. And I don't really think we have anything quite like that in the game so far. That being said, it's never fun to play as the loser, so I could see if this one wasn't necessarily as popular as it might be in my heart. And lastly, we have the Battle of Laupen. This was a Bernese campaign against the not yet assimilated canton of Fribourg, which took on allies among the Burgundians and represents one of the first examples of the Confederacy's influence being stymied by a multi-fronted alliance against them. This would be, again, just a single scenario. It was only one battle. But according to the sources I consulted, it demonstrated a lot of very interesting siege tactics and had a lot of back and forth go on before its eventual conclusion. Plus, it would feature a couple more civilizations than just the normal Swiss on Swiss stuff that you might expect from a scenario depicting the struggle between cantons. With all of the flavor out of the way, let's move on to the major themes that I noticed when I was searching through Swiss history. While the Alps ain't a fun place to live, they are certainly rich in resources. The trade routes that started to open up through Switzerland gave them unbelievable wealth. This, coupled with relative equality under the law in comparison to their other European neighbors, allowed the Swiss to develop an incredibly robust professional economy of craftsmen, artisans, and merchants that stood head and shoulders over those of their neighbors and offered them even more wealth down the line. But all this wealth certainly attracted its fair share of covetous eyes. And this leads me to my second major theme, the rebuffing of invaders. Not only did the Swiss famously do this with the Austrians, but there were plenty of instances where the Burgundians, the Germans, the Italians, many different factions made bids for Swiss lands, and the Swiss were never the kind to take this on the chin. They were incredibly ferocious when they were fighting off incoming foreign invaders, and there are countless stories of militias of Swiss peasants thrashing elite European knights. The Swiss imposed a system of conscription and mandatory military service well before it became popular across the rest of Europe, allowing a simple peasant force to fight with a coordination and skill that was really unheard of in Europe up until that point. Additionally, the Swiss had great ingenuity when they were dealing with incoming invasions. Among their many strategical masterstrokes, including felling trees to block roads, sealing off canyon gorges, flooding areas with dams, and the construction of Letzinen. These were improvised fortifications that were used to shut off enemy mobility options, put them onto unfavorable ground, and seal their retreats. Lastly, republicanism is the foundation of the Swiss nation, and this republican streak ran deep in its people, even as early as 1291, when the federal charter was founded. The autonomous governance that led to this federal charter persisted well into Swiss independence, and was a major feature of their alliance even towards the end of the AoE2 relevant time frame. The Swiss peoples were not a single nation, it was more a coalition of strong alliances that bound a bunch of disparate peoples together under an idea, the idea that they wanted to be free of monarchical rule and determine their own laws and destiny. This also seared into all Swiss minds a deep hatred and mistrust of any form of nobility. It was a mindset that was rather unfamiliar in Europe at the time, and was in many ways very forward-thinking and prescient as to how the continent of Europe would change in the centuries after the AoE2 relevant time frame. With that, we come to the end of the Swiss history section. If you were just here to see history, thank you so much for watching. Remember to like and subscribe before you go. And for all of those who, like me, enjoy Age of Empires and want to see how I would translate all of this history into actual tangibles in-game, let's move on to an overview of my Swiss build. So, to start with, the Swiss are classified as a defensive and economy civilization. Their first civilization bonus is that they can upgrade their town centers to city centers in the Castle Age. What are city centers? I'll get to that in a moment. Secondly, their lumberjacks can remotely deposit wood like Khmer farmers, but only while within the line of sight of a drop point, a lumber camp or town center, and they work a little bit slower to compensate. This means that as the Swiss, you'll want to get Town Watch and Town Patrol as soon as possible to maximize on this bonus. I foresee this being one of the Swiss's most powerful perks, and rest assured I have designed the rest of the Civ with this potential massive power in mind. Their third bonus, representing the Letzinen that I mentioned earlier, is that their palisades cost a third as much as normal and are built 33% faster. This will allow for fun quick walling maneuvers if you are a pro, and for everyone else, it will make it a whole lot easier for you to wall yourself up in early game. Their last civilization bonus is that their crossbowmen are a little bit faster, and their arbalesters, when you upgrade them, are substantially faster and even get a bonus range for free. Sounds broken, but I promise you it's not. You'll see why a little bit later. Now we come to one of the first very funky things about the Swiss. They have 2 team bonuses. Being a civilization focused in the federal charter and peoples coming together, it only made sense that allegiances and allies would be a major focus of the Swiss build, and both of their team bonuses are economically adjacent. The first is that trade carts may trade with town centers. We're getting Age of Mythology up in here, folks, and I anticipate this being almost as relevant in 1v1 as it is in team games, though undeniably useful in both. Their second team bonus is that starting in Feudal Age, villagers get a little bit of HP, scaling up as you advance to Imperial. And this is meant to represent the fact that Swiss citizens were much more protected legally than other peoples in Europe, and their allies could also rest assured that their peoples were much more safe from foreign takeovers and incursions, while the Swiss were keeping a watchful eye over their interests. Moving on to their uniques. The Swiss unique unit is the Reichslaufen. This is the technical term for the pikemen mercenaries that the Swiss were so famous for. The Reichslaufer is an infantryman costing 30 food and 60 gold. It is similar to a Kameyuk, being a ranged spear unit, but it has a little bit less range, about 0.66 of a tile rather than one whole tile. It also has less rate of fire and speed, so it's distinctly slower, and it does less bonus damage against cavalry. The upsides, though, is that the Reichslaufer has substantially higher attack, substantially higher melee armor, though it is locked at 0 ranged armor. It also trains a little bit faster and even has an attack bonus versus trash, making it a little more versatile than a Kameyuk or Spearline unit in what it is good against. Lastly, the Reichslaufer has a special ability allowing it to charge into battle. This means that when an enemy unit comes within line of sight, it will rush at them, gaining bonuses to its speed and rate of fire, making it almost as fast as an Eagle Warrior. However, while it's in this frenzy, you cannot retask the unit. It is locked in combat until the fury fades. This is in reference to the fact that Swiss mercenaries were ferociously brave and also notoriously disobedient on the battlefield when they wanted to sink their teeth into an enemy. This battle rage would not last very long. I think it's like 3 or 4 seconds, and it would recharge only once the Reichslaufer had been out of combat for something like 20 seconds. Of note, if you don't want the Reichslaufer to use its charge attack, you can put them on stand ground stance, and they will not do so. Also important about the Reichslaufer is that they are trained at the barracks. This will become very relevant in a moment because the Swiss cannot build castles. Instead, they build city centers. The city center is an upgrade to the town center, costing 250 gold, 250 stone. This is an upgrade to an individual town center. You click a button, a build animation overlays the TC, and it upgrades itself. You don't need to use villagers, but you can't make it faster. It takes about as long as it takes to make a normal TC with a single villager, so if you want to make a city center, you should throw it up well before you think you will actually need it. A city center has castle-like stats. It gets a multi-shot attack, it gets much better defenses, it gets +1 range, and it does a good deal more damage, but it is still distinctly weaker than a castle proper. It also can research castle technologies, but it does not train castle units, hence why the Reichslaufer is trained at the barracks. Also of note, the city center has the unique ability to train villagers and research a technology at the same time. You can even keep training villagers while you're upgrading your city center in a similar manner. The city center is the core of the Swiss's defensive playstyle. While it doesn't have the oomph of a castle, you can make an awful lot more, and they give you tangential benefits in addition to being strong defensive fortifications. Lastly, to touch upon their unique technologies, the Swiss Castle Age unique technology is called Landsturm. This makes it such that your military units are trained 5% faster for each of your buildings that are currently being attacked. So all those little blinking annoying dots on the minimap, those will actually help you if you have this technology researched. Of course, certain buildings are not counted, like wall segments and farms and a couple others, and it caps out at 50% faster training time. So if there's more than 10 buildings being attacked at once, Landsturm will not help you any more than it already is. The Imperial Age technology for the Swiss is called Swiss Guard. This makes it such that your Reichsläufer become available to all allies at their castle, and you, the Swiss player, will receive 10 gold whenever a Reichsläufer is trained by any player. Not only does this mean that for you they functionally go down in cost by 10 gold, but it means that your allies can actually pay you for the privilege of using your special unit. And I should note that unlike something like the Genitor or the Kipchuks that are given by Cuman mercenaries, Swiss Guard Reichsläufers use the Swiss players' technologies. And it means that civilizations like the Tatars, who normally have garbage infantry, will actually be able to make really good use of Reichsläufers without spending even 1 gold on upgrading them. As always, if you'd like to see the details on any of these particular bonuses and more besides, take a look at the civilization document down in the description. Let's move on to an overview of the Swiss tech tree. What do they get? What do they miss? We'll do the Spirit of the Law style, beginning with their infantry. The Swiss have okay infantry overall, even above average, I'd say. Not only do they have their exceptional unit, the Reichsläufer, which should fill in a lot of the gaps that their missing champion and supplies will leave, but their halberdiers are pretty good, only missing plate mail armor. As mentioned, the Reichsläufer has very good melee armor, and it will get even more melee armor when it is upgraded, so missing plate mail won't hurt that too much. Even so, you shouldn't rely on that unit in every instance. It's far from indestructible. On to their archers. Some elements of the Swiss archery range is great, and some elements are terrible. For one, they are missing Bracer. Remember when I said that +1 range on Arbalest wouldn't be broken? Well, this is why. You'll get that +1 range for free, but you'll miss the 1 attack that goes along with getting Bracer. They also miss the final archer armor upgrade. That being said, they do get access to Thumb Ring, Hand Cannoneer, and of course they have that great bonus for their Arbalesters. And so while your archery range is not going to necessarily be the most powerful, it will be quite versatile and give you really good skirmishing units that can back up your infantry corps and snipe off critical units among your opponents. This is in reference to the fact that in Swiss armies, gunners and crossbowmen were often lightly armored and used as skirmishers, kind of merging with the main infantry line to fire out of a bristling wall of pikes while avoiding incoming enemy attacks and even being used to flank and pick off stragglers. Next of all, cavalry. The Swiss have some of the worst cavalry in the game, though not in all senses. While they are missing almost every cavalry upgrade, including light cav and cavalier and husbandry and plate barding armor, they do have bloodlines. You can still do knight and scout rushes just fine. You have the first 2 barding armor upgrades. And while you do miss husbandry, that's not necessarily essential for executing a good scout rush. So your cavalry is awful in late game. Early game, it's actually pretty okay. Their siege workshop is in a similar position to their archers. They miss a couple of important upgrades like siege ram and siege engineers, but not only do they have the siege onager, which is always a good unit to have around, but they make trebuchets out of their siege workshop. Now, before you get worried that this sounds unbelievably broken, don't worry, I thought of that. The trebuchets do take substantially longer to make than a normal civilization would, but it does mean that you can mass them up far more effectively if that's something you need to do. Even if the Swiss don't quite have the power of a committed siege civ, they have some really interesting strategies available to them. They also have bombard cannon if you feel like that's important as well. Their defenses are some of the best in the game. They have pretty much all the important upgrades. Hoardings doesn't count because they don't have castles. And between their city centers and other various civilization bonuses, you should be very good on the defensive front pretty much right up until late game. And even then, things like Landsturm will help you out a lot. They even have bombard towers if you're one of those 8-player free-for-all degenerates who likes spamming 200 of them. You know exactly who you are. Their eco is also among the best in the game. The only technology they miss is crop rotation, and they have some incredible eco bonuses to back it up. They have that self-trading thing, they have the awesome lumberjack trickle bonus, and even their Imperial Age unique technology, Swiss Guard, can kind of count as an eco bonus in a team game. That being said, their dock is terrible. The worst among all European civilizations. They're missing so many important technologies, though their lumberjack bonus could make it such that they have some sort of advantage in the early game on a water map. Their monks are also thoroughly unremarkable. Most people don't care about monks, but I put them here for thoroughness' sake. Let's move on to their playstyle. How would the Swiss actually work in-game, in my personal opinion? Well, in early game as the Swiss, you're probably going to want to do a fast castle boom. Not only do your bonuses really lend themselves very well to this sort of strategy, but you also have that monstrous eco as a reward if you can get there and really start to churn out villagers. But even though a fast castle boom seems like the main route that you would take, they also have all of the rushes that you would normally want access to. You can do militias into man-at-arms, you can do scouts, you can do knights as I mentioned earlier, but you also have a very good archer rush. Specifically because if you can get a good advantage with your archers in feudal age, then once you hit castle, your crossbows will be quicker than normal. And if you can keep those crossbows until imperial, when you can make them into arbalesters, they will be very powerful until bracer comes online for your opponent. And even then, they'll be fast as hell and can be used to skirmish and harass. In the mid-game, the Swiss are going to have a lot more trouble than in the early game. Your army falls off very hard in early Imperial Age. I don't know if you saw in that previous tech tree segment, but they're missing 4 out of 5 blacksmith technologies, and so their army will be very, very squishy and fall apart in the face of a lot of very staunch opposition. The Reichsläufer is a very strong unit, but being an infantryman and having a couple of baked-in downsides, it certainly can't carry an army and is also very weak against enemy ranged attacks. So in the mid-game, you're generally going to want to stay defensive. You have your city centers, which you could spam en masse and are very annoying to crack through, and you have your Landsturm unique technology to help build up a force after one gets destroyed and your opponent is pushing in. In the late game, however, the Swiss will likely start to turn it around. Your eco will really start to come online if you've gotten to this point. You can set up internal trade routes, your lumberjacks can clear-cut your side of the map, and even though your army is still not fantastic, you can probably outproduce your opponents, compensating for quality with quantity. I should also note that the Swiss will be especially powerful in team games. Their 2 team bonuses will help all of their allies get through to the late game without getting cheesed down early on, and Swiss Guard is a very useful payoff, especially for civilizations that don't normally have access to good infantry. So that's my analysis for how I think the Swiss would actually play in game. Before we wrap up this particular video, however, let's end off, as always, with a couple of loose threads. Beginning with some things that I wasn't quite sure about with this build, some unanswered questions that I'd love to get your take on in the comments section down below. First of all, the Swiss are missing a lot. They don't have good cavalry, they have a crappy dock, they don't even get the castle. Is all of this too much? Like, the meso-civs miss a lot, and the Swiss miss... The Swiss miss even more than them if you count the castle. And while I think that my build does a good job of still providing them plenty of options, I could see it being just a little bit too much. Second of all, while I was building the Swiss, I noticed that they had a couple of similarities to my Dutch build. I don't think it's that bad, but I'd love to hear your opinion on whether you feel the two are much too alike and should be distinguished further, especially now that I recently did that recraft of the Dutch that streamlined the civilization out more and make their economy bonuses a little bit less wacky. Lastly, the fact that the Swiss get those faster crossbows, I don't think it will be too bad because they do miss bracer, but even so, that could be super annoying. I don't know how bad it would be, and I do really like the bonus. Archer rushes are not very fun when you're on the receiving end, and if you can't even catch the damn things, that makes it even worse. So those are all the lingering questions I had, but let's move on to some of the fun stuff. Some of the ideas that I thought about using for this build, but on balance decided would not be as well suited as the ones that I listed earlier on. Let's get into it. For one, I had an idea where the Swiss could have multiple architecture styles as well as languages. I thought it could be super cool and very pretty, but also very incohesive and confusing. So that's why I decided not to go with that one. I also had an idea to use the Kapelbrug, which I did use as a picture earlier in this presentation, as the wonder. It's this beautiful bridge. It was built during the AoE2 relevant time frame, but having a bridge across a river be a wonder, like that's a lot of water on the foundation. Doesn't really make sense. Kind of awkward in the middle of like whatever grassy field you stick it in. So I decided to go with the cool clock tower instead. I also had the idea that every single time a villager is working, it could give you a very small trickle of gold, like piddly piddly. This one felt a little too funky to balance, and I've heard a couple people say that they don't like trickles as a mechanic. But moving on to military stuff, I also had an idea where that speed bonus that the arbalesters get could also apply to the Swiss hand cannoneers and my arquebusiers. Kind of a cool combined arms bonus that gave them a little more versatility in what their late game ranged powerhouse unit was. I decided to go against it just because it felt a little bit too overloaded, but I could definitely be convinced that this one is the right way to go. I also had the idea that all units could get bonus attack versus knights, eagles, and unique units in reference to the Swiss hatred of nobility. In the end, I decided to not go with it just because it felt a little bit lame in comparison to the other bonuses that I had, but if we ever decide that the Swiss needed something a little bit more toned down or a little bit more streamlined, this is the one I would probably go with. In reference to Swiss mobilization, I had the idea that Town Bell could turn your villagers into temporary soldiers. I've wanted a call to arms mechanic in Age of Empires for ages. This is something I will probably go over in a future video as well, and this was my chance to implement it. It was my big chance, guys. I don't really know why I didn't go with this bonus beyond the fact that I liked the other ones a little bit better, and this one seemed kind of logistically complicated. So we'll save this one for a completely different video where I can talk about why it should apply to everyone instead. On a slightly more simplistic note, the Swiss made a lot of use of the unforgiving terrain of the Alps in their military campaigns, and my idea of how to reference this could be making it such that their damage multiplier from shooting over a cliff could be drastically increased, kind of like the Tatar Hill bonus. The downside of this is that it doesn't apply to melee units, and that cliffs are a lot rarer than elevations. So this one did not feel quite as practical, but I really wanted to use some sort of terrain military bonus of some variety, and I'm a little bummed it didn't quite work out. In terms of the civilization's more unique elements, I did at one point have the idea where the Swiss Guard technology could give your Reisläufer and Spear line a rate of fire increase to make your own Reisläufer a little bit more special than the ones that you were sending to your allies, as well as giving the Spear line a little bit of love, but it felt like it was overloading the technology. I had a bunch of other unique technology ideas that I decided not to go with for the Civ as well. First being Bundesbrief. This is the name for the federal charter of the original Old Swiss Confederacy, and this technology would allow TCs to convert nearby non-military units and buildings, meaning you plop down a town center and it just steadily converts everything around it. Super cool? I think so. Super annoying? Probably. And also logistically complicated, and also requires forward town centers. There was a lot wrong with this idea, but I wish it could work. I'm going to do a converting building at some point, just it's not going to be today. Similarly, I had another technology called Tagsatzung. This was the term for a local autonomous council during the days before the Confederacy even occurred, and this would make it such that all of your economic buildings, town centers, docks, and markets, would work twice as fast. Very powerful, probably restricted to the Imperial Age, a really good economy bonus, and maybe even making their docks a little bit viable. It was just a little bit boring and felt much less fitting than the other two technologies I ended up going with, but if civilizations could have 3 unique technologies, which I also considered for the Swiss, I'll have you know, Tagsatzung would probably be my third pick to round out the Swiss's current roster. Next of all, I had an idea for another unique technology, the Lucerne Hammer. This was a fairly well-known Swiss polearm, and it would give the spear line armor penetration. Considering the change I recently made to the Dutch Burger, this technology felt quite redundant and would definitely make the potential parallels between the Swiss and the Dutch a lot more unavoidable. And lastly, a unique technology called Voorhut, which would be a combined arms bonus, making your spears and Reisläufer stronger when near your archers and gunners, and vice versa. The melee units probably getting better armor, and the archers and gunners probably getting better accuracy or damage or range or something. Is it historically authentic? Yes, this is exactly how the Swiss fought. Is it interesting? I think so, but it is also very logistically complicated, and I didn't want the Swiss to be like an aura civ like some of my other recent ones like the Jurchens have been, though an interesting idea that I might revisit with another civ in future. And with all that, we come to the end of this Swiss build. Thank you so very much for watching. Before we sign off today, let's take a look at the likeliniometer. How likely is it, in my opinion, that the Swiss could make it into Age of Empires 2 in future, maybe even looking a little bit like the build that you've seen here? And for the Swiss, on the likeliniometer today, we have a 9 out of 10. I think the Swiss are a shoo-in. They're one of the last major Central and Western European powers that are not thoroughly represented in the game. They have an incredibly iconic part in medieval European history with their pikemen mercenaries, but that's just what I think. I want to hear what you think. Tell me what you think about my build for the Swiss. Do you think I got anything particularly right? Do you think I got anything particularly wrong? Are there any balance points that you think are completely out of whack? And most of all, what Age of Empires topic, be it a civilization, a unit, a more broad-ranging mechanical thing like adding a call to arms button, would you like to see me tackle next in one of these videos? Also, I'd love to hear your your thoughts on this new presentation format. I've cut down on the number of slides that I use, and I've tried to condense the information. So please tell me your opinion on it, and whether you want me to go back to the old original format, or whether you like this one, or whether you think I could improve it even further. And with all that being said, thank you so very much for watching. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day. Make sure to like and subscribe before you go. My name has been Robbie Howell, and ciao for now.